Okay, so thank you very much, Susanna, for having accepted this invitation. I'm really pleased to talk to you and also enjoyed enormously reading your book. If you don't mind, I will start with a brief introduction about you, and then we'll start with the questions.
Sounds great.
Right. Okay. So Suzanne Schneider is Deputy Director, and if there is something updated, you can correct me later. Is Deputy Director and core faculty at Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, specializing in political theory and history of the modern Middle East. She's the author of Mandatory Separation, Religion, Education, and Mass Politics in Palestine, and also The Apocalypse and the End of History, Modern Jihad and the Crisis of Liberalism, the book that we are going to focus on today mainly. So her writing about contemporary politics, religion, and violence has appeared in the different magazines from New Republic, Mother Jones, Washington Post, and so on and so forth. She's currently working on a new book about the use of risk as a social and political tool. So welcome here, Susanna. And so my first question is, what brought you to get to this research, and what is significance of this research, especially given that you seem to come from a religious studies background, if I'm not wrong?
Kind of, for better or worse, my formal degrees were in a Middle Eastern Studies department, which is kind of interdisciplinary by design. And, I always say, yes, for better or worse, I've never known a disciplinary divide. And my own work is, I would say, kind of like a hybrid of religious studies and history and political theory. But actually, for this work on kind of contemporary jihad and how we think about jihad alongside other forms of violence, I found myself really drawn to the theories and frameworks coming from political theory, really instead of religious studies, because it's actually the dominant, I think, attempts to talk about jihad really do come from within this Islamic studies world or religious studies world. And I found those approaches to be really to just be kind of underwhelming at the end of the day, or really limited in terms of what they could explain about the present. And they kind of, they would typically be this, textualist-based genealogical approach where you pour over certain verses from the Quran, and then you talk about your Ibn Taymiyyah, and then you jump to your Sayyid Qutb, and voila, we have ISIS. And I was just really, very, very underwhelmed by those types of approaches. And also, at the end of the day, the kind of minute questions and kind of classifications of, of the Sharia and of fiqh are of, relevance here, of course, but most of the, people I was reading about or, was kind of researching who are drawn to a group like the Islamic State were not delving into the kind of the volumes of fiqh. They were attracted to this project for reasons that seem to have much more to do with kind of contemporary social, political, and economic conditions than having a deep knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence. So while I kind of had to use, had to have some sort of awareness, obviously, of the debates within religious studies and Islamic studies in particular, I, tried to actually use a different set of tools in talking about the emergence of contemporary jihad, the tools of political and social theory, which both enable us to kind of escape this, this kind of essentialist view that it is really, it's something particular to Islam that we can have, that there can be no parallels to and no explanations of, and that is seemingly devoid of any sort of relationship with the kind of material world and material surroundings. So yes, I have a little bit of a religious studies background, and yet I kind of, quite purposely set it aside in writing this book in order to ask a different sort of questions than those that usually circulate in discussions about jihad.
Thank you very much. Again, sorry for the quality of this video today. Susanna, there is a lot to unpack, but let's start with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism brings otherwise dichotomous spots together, and your book also brings oppositional phases of jihad and neoliberalism into conversation, which finally leaves us with plenty of similarities. understandably. I always have a hard time coming across neoliberalism. I usually get a bit of a scare when I come to neoliberalism in research, as I'm afraid it erodes differences. What is neoliberalism in your view? I mean, the definition, and why is it important to take it into account?
So I think of neoliberalism as kind of these interrelated phenomena that happen at the level of states, markets, and social relations, kind of, speaking quite broadly. So on the one hand, it's a set of beliefs, and they are truly almost like religious beliefs about the efficiency of the market, the way that kind of price and market conditions function under kind of the optimal conditions of competition, without state intervention, as being the kind of the very best way to kind of allocate resources in some sort of kind of abstract world. So as a kind of economic theory, it's very much indebted to, well, first this kind of group of Austrian thinkers, and then a number of economists who were at the University of Chicago. And in practical terms, neoliberal economic theory pushes an approach to governance, which says that the state should not interfere in the rational workings of the market. The market will kind of distribute its goodies in this, in an optimal way, absent state intervention. And that kind of contrary to the modes of economic thinking which had been dominant since kind of the Great Depression onward, kind of Keynesian countercyclical spending, that governments actually need to spend to prop up kind of the economy to kind of account for the crises of the business cycle, right? Neoliberalism says, no. We have to have a kind of a completely different approach to governance that will, in theory, has this kind of laissez-faire, kind of like hands-off view of interventions and management of the economy. And alongside then this kind of, alongside this approach to governance, right, you have, the kind of implications that come from that, which is that as much of market activity, as much of human behavior as possible should actually be brought into the realm of the marketplace, because the marketplace will be a more efficient mechanism for the distribution of social goods than the state ever could be. So, it kind of pushes to privatize everything from education to healthcare to utilities, water supplies, so on and so forth. All of this kind of stems from the idea that bringing those things into the marketplace will make them more efficient. But the flip side of that is that, this involves a kind of process of taking it's a truly anti-democratic process, where it says that actually the distribution of these social goods should not be subject to some sort of political compromises or kind of political processes, but really subject to market forces, which are themselves, supposedly not only like benevolent, but just in some way. And then the kind of final piece of it is the social relations, which is the kind of, this view of, kind of central to the economic theory is this idea of the kind of rational calculating individual homo economicus who is constantly optimizing, their opportunities, and is, through this kind of, these phases of kind of ruthless competition with everyone around them. And it's a mode of thinking that kind of privileges the individual as the chief unit of all social and political activity. And this has enormous implications from from everything from, yes, like, we can talk about like individualism in kind of philosophical terms. We can talk about the kind of fetishization of like entrepreneurs and these kind of, individuals as like the real movers and shakers, beyond any sort of collective or structural forces. But we can talk about this as like, this has this interesting kind of moralizing turn, where everything is a kind of question of the individual's individual choices, absent any sort of kind of broader horizon or kind of collective framework. And so neoliberalism kind of tends to encourage always thinking about problems as an individual one. So like the example I like to give is, with regard to climate change, for instance, you have all of this discourse kind of thrust upon individuals like, oh, are you recycling? Are you using your, disposable shopping bags? Are you using your beauty products made out of, natural dyes, and so on and so forth? And what these discourses do, right, is it thrusts all of this responsibility onto the individual as if, right, as if we have climate change because the housewives of New Jersey are not recycling enough, rather than because of the, realities of a kind of fossil fuel economy. And so at every level, it seems to kind of shift the responsibility for dealing with these kind of collective issues onto the unit that is least able to handle them, the individuals. So this is kind of a very broad outline of, neoliberalism again, and it's, in these kind of three components. The final thing I will just say about this is that, right, this is of course a theory of neoliberalism. This is kind of how it operates according to its even proponents. But what's very, very central to note about neoliberalism is that it shouldn't be regarded, I think, as a kind of form of like laissez-faire organization, because neoliberalism needs the state. It desperately needs the state. What it needs to do is capture the regulatory mechanisms of the state and make the state work for capital. So this is not about kind of a true separation between the market and state forces, but really about kind of the capture of the state. And similarly, in order to kind of enforce these, kind of neutral, optimal market conditions and all of the kind of social crises they produce, particularly in the ways of increased inequality, limits of, wage stagnation, just kind of across the board, you also need a more punitive system. So it's like not a coincidence that this kind of, these gaping charts showing the kind of, growth of inequality in, developed Western countries also parallel the rise of things like mass incarceration. That as the system grows more and more unequal, actually it requires the state and state violence to kind of prop up where consent is no longer doing the work. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's like very long-winded, but it's complicated. I don't know what to tell you.
No, absolutely. Thank you. But now let's move to Jihad. I mean, like during the book, throughout the book, you have the idea that declaring Jihad and the authority declaring Jihad, namely the sovereign power behind it, has transformed. You argue that Jihad has transformed from a collective obligation to something individual. What does this transformation imply, Suzanne?
Yeah, so I mean, this is, and again, and let's just specify, I'm speaking within kind of the Sunni world here, but that, if you look at, very broadly speaking, right, these kind of classical treatments of jihad, you have the, these kind of different designations within Sharia, that, jihad is fard kifaya, that it's a kind of a collective obligation. And it's kind of often compared to something like burying the dead, right? It's a communal obligation to bury the dead. And I think that this makes intuitive sense if we think about like, just even like laws of war and theories of war as they developed in other contexts, for example, in the West, where is this idea that, yes, of course, waging war it's the duty of the prince, so the duty of the king or the sovereign. You don't just have like individual peasants having the capacity to declare war, right? This would have been kind of a logical absurdity. And this kind of, and so kind of understanding the contemporary manifestations of jihad requires coming to terms with how that legal designation gets overturned. And it really doesn't get overturned until the 20th century. Like, so, rather recently. And, there are a few different kind of figures who are associated with this, but Sayyid Qutb is the kind of main ideologue who, kind of pivots toward thinking about jihad. No, it's no longer this kind of collective obligation, but actually it's an individual duty. Why is it an individual duty? Well, because in the, in the context of Qutb is writing, so the, kind of post-colonial, Egyptian state, the leaders themselves are essentially non-believers. They are, and they're kind of like, we can call them like Muslims in name only. And on account of that, they've kind of forfeited their right to direct the faithful in jihad. So what happens? Well, jihad kind of devolves to the individual within this setting. So it becomes an individual responsibility, right, or fard ayn. And this is kind of Qutb's major, major point through, this work of his milestones, that I think kind of paves the way for this entire development of jihad as an insurgent movement, which is no longer a tool of states, no longer a mode of waging war by Muslim states, but a tactic to be used against states by insurgents, by revolutionaries, so on and so forth. So actually, when we're narrating the history of jihad, what we have to contend with is this massive rupture. And again, particularly these treatments coming from the Islamic studies world tend to kind of obscure that by, emphasizing this kind of long continuity from the Prophet's time down to the present. So my work kind of says, no, this major rupture happens in the 20th century. And so not only does that mean that kind of contemporary jihad doesn't look like its kind of classical or like even medieval predecessors because of this fundamental reworking of this the question of sovereignty and responsibility, but it also, strangely enough, seems to parallel some things that are happening in the non-Islamic world as well, particularly with regard to this, the elevation of the individual as the kind of key unit of social and political change that we just talked about before, as this kind of byproduct of neoliberalism. And so it's a whether you want to call it an interesting coincidence or you want to call it the kind of differentiated manifestations of the same kind of global phenomena experienced unevenly, what Qutb is talking about is a world in which individual responsibility rules the day because collective units can no longer be trusted to enact any sort of meaningful change. And that is so resonant, I think, with the kind of broader history of neoliberalism that it struck me that we had to talk about Qutb in those terms of social and political theory, beyond looking at the kind of the novelties of his actual like interpretive work. That let's actually also try to situate him within that framework as to why is it that the individual is become so key in this way? Because this is again both novel within the broader history of jihad, but also so deeply resonant with these broader shifts that are occurring in the West as well.
Right, great. So two other characteristics, or let's say two other similarities that you in the book present are those that you borrow from. One of them is the one that you borrow from Faisal David's idea that the way that jihad works in its contemporary sense is very similar to the way the NGOs function. And the other one, which was very interesting, was the idea that you borrowed apparently from Adriana Cavarero, the difference between heroism and terrorism. I would be thankful, Susanna, if you just like focus on these two similarities that you borrowed from these two authors.
Yeah, so I mean, Faisal wrote this wonderful book called Landscapes of Jihad, which is definitely kind of left a mark on my thinking about this topic, which was I think maybe like 2003, 2005. I can't remember precisely, but he kind of and he's working on Al Qaeda. He's working on a slightly different pool of sources than I was. My work is chiefly about the Islamic State. But he notes that the kind of effective appeal that that Al Qaeda would make to kind of the to the masses in the name of kind of suffering, right? That your Muslim brethren kind of around the world are suffering because of X, Y, and Z. What exactly are you doing about it? That this kind of paralleled the way is that like a Save the Children or something like this would talk about this this almost like humanitarian impulse. And he actually has another wonderful article about this called Terrorist as Humanitarian, which is definitely worth checking out if you want to think along those lines. Right. So I think that there is definitely something there, and I kind of, in my own spin on it, I would say like tried to think about this particularly in where we said my book is almost 20 years after Faisal's, and the conditions are slightly different. In particular, right, we live in the social media era, which was not the case in for the kind of earlier Al Qaeda generation. Where there is this it's to think about again these kind of appeals being put out in various kind of jihadi publications or on Telegram channels, etc., within the framework of like a Twitter universe of like doom scrolling, and social media being able to see everything that is kind of wrong with the world in like one fell swoop. And how incredibly, how psychically demobilizing that can be. So I really took this very, very seriously as right, something that happens to me, something I know that happens to my friends, where this kind of awareness of just how deeply screwed up the world is, right, and the kind of depths of these systemic problems can make your whatever response you have seem incredibly futile. And this kind of sense of like hopelessness based on the kind of again like the magnitude of the problems. And what I found very fascinating about the way that the Islamic State kind of ties into this is that it spoke exactly to that, right? It says it gives people this allure of agency. Like, don't just sit there on your computer and watch. You can be here with us making a difference. And I think that allure to some sort of agency, the allure to actually, you know, to change something in a substantive way, it is so incredibly attractive, and has to, again, be conceptualized within this realm of where futility is the more common experience of the kind of the political subject. And the kind of final thing I'll mention about the kind of, you know, just the language and the ways of speaking and thinking here that I worked on was, you know, these, I did look at a number of kind of the Islamic State publications for when I was writing this book. And so, you know, and there's been lots of studies of kind of jihadi publications, and particularly their kind of their gore. And the question is, are they gotten more gory over time? The kind of aestheticization of violence, all of that jazz. I talked a little bit about that, but the thing that I talked about more, which is something that actually no one really had talked about, which is that in addition to the gore, you have these like things that look like they're like corporate reports, like, you know, like pie charts and bar graphs, and kind of, I mean, literally they look, the form of them is lifted from the corporate report. This is how profitable we were this term. This is what our results were. But right, you've transposed the categories. This is how many people we've killed of each of these different categories in these different fields of operation. This is how many vehicles we've captured of various types. And every single, you know, publication, you know, particularly if the kind of Islamic State newspaper would have this kind of accounting, this like executive summary, again, in like corporate reporting style that like could have been learned at McKinsey, about trying to sum up their results. And I found this endlessly fascinating as both the kind of real, just like penetration of a kind of like neoliberal mode of kind of corporatization, even within this, you know, most reactionary of spaces on the one hand, and on the other of this notion that like, you know, that of you know, jihadis that have to issue progress reports, that have to say like, this is what we're accomplishing, this is what we're doing. And again, I think that that taps into this this sense of agency, and the sense of restoring agency to a political subject who feels stuck, or who feels that their activities are kind of futile. It's like, oh no, these guys are producing something, they're really giving us results.
Right.
So, but again, you can't get to any of that if you're just looking at like, you know, 8th century like commentaries on jihad. So we need a different toolbox if we want to ask these questions.
Yeah, that's interestingly, actually, it's related to the next question I wrote here. It's like there is a sentence that you highlight in the book: no one is free to choose falsehood in that regard. I mean, what the way they propose. I will be happy, Susanna, if you explain the role of free will as what links these two seemingly opposite trends. One, yeah, very progressive neoliberal; the other, very reactionary mentality of Islamism. In particular, because as you put it, I'm quoting you, the degradation of individual choice also differentiates the Islamic State from previous ideologues like Sayyid Qutb, who argued that human emancipation was the ultimate aim of jihad. End of quote.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's okay. It's very complicated. I'll do my best to sketch a kind of a full picture here. So on the one hand, yes, how should we think about individual choice? Well, on the one hand, all of the, you know, much of the kind of jihadi, I mean, I've made this argument for years, right? Much of the jihadi approaches to the Quran, or to the kind of Islamic canon, particularly around jihad, but really around, you know, much else as well, is kind of highly marked by this kind of individualism. And I say it's like it's essentially like a form of Protestantism, where they kind of, you know, want to go back to the sources, go back to the kind of the Quran and the Sunnah, and say all of the kind of commentators, all of this stuff, this is just kind of, this is needless mediation between us and the truth, and that the truth is there, it's easily accessible, right? You know, put those settings to, you know, accessible to, it's obvious as day to anyone who, you know, has an Arabic dictionary, maybe you might need, but like other than that, it's just clear as day what the directives are. And of course, right, this is a view of kind of the law and a view of what one should do, how one should conduct themselves, that the jurists would dispute endlessly, right? That the kind of scholarly classes have said, no, this is actually incredibly complicated. It's not just some kind of thing that any Joe, Bob, or Harry can pick up his Quran and decide what to do. And of course, this has to do with the kind of intermediating role of the jurists, of the ulama, and with the kind of status of scholarly knowledge itself and kind of expertise. So you have this, on the one hand, kind of like upstart idea that you see in Qutb, but I think you see kind of, I mean, really down to the present, down to many of these recruiting videos that are still in circulation, that basically direct people to just pick up the Quran and read it, and if you do, everything will become clear and you'll know what jihad is and if you should do jihad or not. I'm like quoting directly from one of these videos. So this is one way to think about the individual, is the individual as interpreter, the individual rights to kind of create these sorts of interpretations. Certainly, we've already talked about the individual in terms of Qutb's notion of individual responsibility for jihad, kind of shift away from collective action. But yes, in Qutb's view, right, Qutb had these like quasi-democratic, elements to his thinking, which make it very interesting, because even though he has this view of the Sharia as all-encompassing and of kind of Jahiliya and Hakimiyya, kind of like these kind of ages of ignorance and divine sovereignty as being these kind of oppositional states, and he envisions an ideal society that will, in which people are essentially administering a divine law which has already been given, because the work of human interpretation is no longer needed in this view of the Sharia as kind of ready-made and already accessible. But he's very clear that, that in his view, that why is he doing this? He's doing this for the sake of freedom, because the kind of tyrants that have, and he uses the kind of this term kind of lifted from the Quran of the taghut, of the tawaghit, the kind of, which literally the idols. And in his use, and really further now down to the present in kind of jihadi publications, right, this literally means like the tyrants, so those who have elevated themselves above the kind of the rest of humanity. So all this kind of class of dictators, it's not merely that they are kind of dictatorial, but like they're creating, they're essentially elevating themselves to a divine level. It's like an act of idolatry to say, right, my rule is kind of final within this situation. And so, Qutb views the overthrow of this kind of collection of dictators and tyrants as being something that will pave the way for kind of genuine human freedom and the kind of genuine kind of practice of religion, and what he sees as kind of the optimal form. Now, so this is kind of one landmark. Now, but fast forward, because so some things obviously stay somewhat consistent within this, but like also things radically shift. So in the Islamic State kind of redux of this, actually human freedom is no longer something that we're aiming at, really at all. And so even within this kind of liturgy on jihad, you have these kind of radical breaks between things that seem like superficially to be quite similar. So it's no longer that we're really aiming at human freedom. If anything, there's all of this attention put into kind of these theological justifications around how this notion that choice is not optimal. That that choice is not, to this notion of kind of choice has been so fetishized. Again, it takes us back to our neoliberal economists. But this notion of choice and being able to choose whatever you want in life, et cetera, that this is not something that the kind of Sharia can allow for. That if you are to have choice, the choice can only be within these very narrow bounds of what is deemed kind of admissible or appropriate. And I think it's I only write about this a tiny bit in the book itself, but I've been thinking about it a lot, because it actually does echo some of the arguments you hear from these kind of on the new kind of far right actors, particularly kind of political philosophers and kind of new nationalists, who are putting forth these arguments in the West that seem to have this kind of authoritarian underpinning to them. about like, well, that maybe democracy is not actually the best model. Maybe we don't really want choice. Maybe unrestrained choice is not actually optimal. You see this in the West with people who are talking about a kind of reinvigorated Christian liberty, and Christian liberty as being something quite different than libertinism or absolute kind of freedom of choice. So kind of moving away from like a John Stuart Mill notion that you have freedom of choice lest it kind of harm another, to a much more narrow vision of what choice is that the state is required to enforce the boundaries of. So again, that relationship between the kind of narrowing boundaries of what is of individual freedom and the need for a repressive state to enforce those boundaries, I'm seeing again pop up in multiple places here. And we can say, oh, this is again just a coincidence, and perhaps it is, or perhaps, as I would suggest, it kind of is related to these kind of broader structural transformations, and that even though these things are not identical, but it is very interesting and fruitful to put them into conversation with one another.
Right, which I mean, quite actually righteously and understandably, you highlight this point in the book. I'm quoting you: with the effective disappearance of left-wing challenges over the past 40 years, in Margaret Thatcher's infamous formulation, "There is no alternative," it's hardly surprising that religious militants have harnessed popular discontent to fuel their own reactionary ideas. Susanne, do you think this as a common denominator between secular Western world and Islamic reformist attempts?
Yes. I mean, very, very, again, these things, I don't want to collapse the context, because the contexts are very important, but right, I'll speak, in the United States, which is the place that kind of, I know best as another kind of political setting. Like how do we explain the kind of mass movement of, people into the Trump camp? This kind of like, the kind of the army of the disaffected, and right, and some of those people are certainly not kind of, there's this idea of all of the kind of the Trumpist base being all kind of, these, struggling working class people who are kind of, but that's not entirely the case. Of course, there's very wealthy people, much of capital is lined up still, behind the GOP, behind the kind of, Trumpist project, so on and so forth. But I don't think that you are able to you're able to win out against a kind of right-wing populism from a kind of centrist position of the status quo is just fine, it's working so great for you, and which is what I would kind of associate with like a kind of like the Clintonian, or even like Obama, kind of like mainstream, Democratic position. And that absent a left alternative that actually acknowledges that people are suffering, that the status quo is terrible for any number of reasons for millions and millions of people, which again, the mainstream Democratic Party does not want to do that, and that will require some sort of massive structural transformation to make people's lives less miserable. Absent that, then yes, people will be attracted to the kind of right-wing version of this, which promises the overthrow of the status quo, not by kind of creating a genuine, like, participatory and like robust democracy, but through this kind of elevation of the authoritarian leader, who can kind of live vicariously through his power, and who feeds you these kind of access spectacle in lieu of actual like substantive change. So yes, I think that in some of these kind of broader political dynamics, I think we can definitely draw some parallels.
Right. Again, I'm quoting you: "I have argued throughout that jihad is not an unbroken chain that can be accounted for by remaining within the comfortable bounds of Islam, or even the broader category of religious violence." End of quote. Susanne, do you think that violence has taken a new form? Normally, people prefer talking about evolution when it comes to peace and progress in communication, then thinking of evolution in terms of violence, colonialism, and power. Can we infer through new form of jihad, a new form of violence, which is not necessarily restricted to the religious world, as you say?
No, absolutely. I mean, it was one of the kind of first things that kind of drew me to this topic and kind of helped me, pave my approach to it, which is that, right, to think about jihad alongside the kind of history of warfare. Because again, if we move away from the kind of fetishization of jihad as something that's like so unique and mystical and specific to Islam that we could never possibly understand it or compare it to anything else, we regard jihad in a little more kind of mundane terms as like a form of war, then it would be very strange if it didn't transform as the broader history of warfare has transformed, right? War looks very different today than it did in, the First World War. So like, why would we expect that jihad would kind of maintain a stable form over time? So there's a whole bundle of like unsustainable assumptions about the stability of these kind of, social and political forms, I think that they're required in order to maintain that view. And far more interesting to me is that this, movement of jihad from kind of states and collective entities onto individuals, onto non-state actors, seems to also parallel the kind of breakdown of the state as the kind of like the monopoly, as having the sole kind of monopoly on violence. And like, where do we see this? We see this in the rise of like non-state actors, frankly, all over the world of varied sorts, right? Non-state actors are not just kind of revolutionary guerrilla groups. They're like Amazon, which is like basically like a sovereign domain that does exert a great deal of, if not kind of like formal violence, then certainly, kind of pressure and control and coercion over vast amounts of people. So it's, and so you have, and the other form of non-state actors that I write about extensively in the book is the kind of rise of the kind of private military companies, the kind of, the contractors, so on and so forth, as another mode of kind of violence outside of the state. And these, they're often kind of contracted by states. So for instance, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States routinely had far more contractors than it had regular troops. The advantage of the contractors is that they escape scrutiny. There's just not the same level of kind of public oversight that that's possible to do in these kind of private corporations. So they offer a very, very convenient way to continue fighting the war, but in increasingly invisible terms, which is exactly what the war on terror wanted to be, right? Kind of maximal impacts abroad, but render it almost as invisible as possible to the domestic public. So, right, the private military company kind of allows them to kind of have their cake and eat it too in that sense. But it's not just states that are engaging these things, right? Any like extractive company, Glencore, these kind of like oil gas companies, be sure they have their own like little private armies as well, that exercises, incredible amounts of good control, that does use deadly violence, to protesters, environmentalists, any number of people who have kind of get in their way. So again, to think about jihad and the kind of in this world in which the state is no longer the kind of prime actor, where state power has been eroded through the new ascent of these kind of like corporate sovereigns, and that you have a kind of a fragmentation of power. You also have a fragmentation of violence that kind of goes with that. And so I think about like jihad also in these terms as being like yet another manifestation of this kind of privatization of violence under neoliberalism. Everything else has been privatized. Why shouldn't violence be privatized too?
Great. Susanna, there is a system preservation, as you say in an interview, attributed jihad to something in the past or the exotic other. Primacy of the individual and privatization of violence, as you already said, engineering thought, media, and some other aspects. They're all aspects of this new form that relates us to our system today. Yet I can imagine it sounds extremely provocative and intensely irritating to tell someone in the West that jihad has roots here.
Well, or that rather it's right.
I mean, I was talking about your book to a friend. Sorry, I was like talking about your book to a friend in Berlin in a cafe, and he was really, I mean, he's Iranian. Yeah, he was like provoked. No, I mean, like it's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? That is in fact where not necessarily the jihad has kind of roots here, but that there's a kind of common that right, but we live in this world of, of global structural shifts and conditions that are experienced in uneven ways, but ways that are kind of ultimately related to the same kind of, the same global phenomena. We live in an era of neoliberal capital. No matter where you live in an era of neoliberal capital. There's no outside of that system. It will manifest itself differently in different places based on the kind of context and the, the source text, however we want to say it. But that I do think that there is some sort of fundamental relationship here with these, our broader kind of structural conditions. So yes, there is this element of, yes, there is this element of kind of, I think, revulsion at this argument that, like, what are you saying? That how can we possibly be the problem? and I accept that, and it's, I guess I've been buried in this literature for so long that it is, but that there's no other conclusion that I could come to. And like the phenomenon that I am explaining do not stem naturally from the world of Islam. There's just no way to explain this stuff by, like, delving deeper into the Quranic commentaries or something like this. But yes, we badly want these forms of violence, or this mode of kind of political and social activity to be something else, right? So it's either like a medieval relic that should have been vanquished by modernity, but for some reason it's kind of like, come Frankenstein or like zombie has like come back and reared its ugly head. Of course, there's like nothing medieval about this mode of jihad, and I trace this kind of relentlessly in the book, how hyper modern a group like the Islamic State is at every single turn. And so we either want it, yes, to belong to this pre-modern world, or to belong to this like unique Islamic world that will be in this kind of forever existential and ontological standoff with these things called the West, and that the two twain shall never meet. And yes, and it is a way of kind of preservation, both of the self and of the system. To say, oh no, we are pure. There's nothing wrong here, right? But I just find it's like much more both faithful to the sources and frankly just much more politically useful to delve in and to be open to those points of comparison and to the places where the boundaries actually are quite blurry. Right? Like nobody, like, why would we ever accept this, thesis of these kind of, cultural units that are kind of completely separate and don't relate to one another and don't have, this is like Samuel Huntington garbage. Like, how are we like still considering this as a viable option? So yes, I understand that it sounds completely counterintuitive, particularly in the West, if you have been kind of brought up on they hate our freedom sort of steady diet of kind of commentary from the New York Times' finest journalists. But I just encourage people to, like, give the argument a chance. Read the book. Like it's written in a way I think that's pretty broadly accessible. And I try to give as much evidence as possible to say, listen, the way that we've been taught to think about these things is really not the case. And then just try to ask yourself, well, what are the implications of that? A, why have we been taught to think about it in this way? What kind of purpose is that serving? And B, what would it mean to say that actually these, to think about the Islamic State not as an instantiation of kind of medieval barbarism, but as a, contextually rooted version of kind of far right reactionaries. That like, what does that do to our thinking? Because I do think it opens up like new spaces for thinking about how to oppose these movements than is possible if we just regard them as kind of leftovers in the past.
Right, great. Again, I have a couple of questions left. So, I'm quoting you, as we witness the breakdown of. I have a lot of quotes from your book. That was, I just like. I think I could have like 25 questions, but I reduced them to like 10, 12. So again, quoting you, as we witness the breakdown of the modern state's capacity to monopolize violence, complete with proliferation of non-state actors that disrupt sovereign claims. What is the point? That was your code. What's the point of your research for those who are in countries where they are experiencing any sort of stagnation, from water stagnation to any kind of economic stagnation, yet whose states are not necessarily shrinking, but on the contrary, it is more the rigid and solidified state. Do you see this solidification of and of the state in those countries, and the infinite flow in neoliberalism, as Deleuze would call it, perhaps, as inseparable bedfellows.
Yeah, I mean, like because as I mentioned before, kind of in saying that we shouldn't ever take neoliberals at their word when they talk about their system as kind of freeing the market from the state intervention. That the and as the really to think about this thing, to think about this far more in terms of like state capture, and then the amount of violence that is required to inflict this agenda is far more productive for us. And so yes, I would expect that as states continue to double down on on these policies, that more and more violence, more and more repression becomes the kind of rule of the day. And we can think about and the kind of question of like the kind of solidifying state, the authoritarian state, kind of the all of the modes of kind of surveillance that the state has available to it that it didn't even have, 10 or 20 years ago. It's also kind of impossible to think about those questions and what the technologies of statehood are outside of the kind of framework of neoliberalism, of technology companies, of the kind of the sense of the creating, whether it's like creating these like facial recognition softwares, there's massive amounts of kind of surveillance that's opened up by technology companies who claim to kind of be, only doing good, but yet more than happy to sell their product to, various authoritarian states, or frankly, to whomever is the highest bidder. Again, outside any sort of kind of democratic management of these technologies, like that's kind of to be expected. So yeah, I do see these things as kind of still in lockstep, but it is the challenge then is where are the sites of potential intervention when the state becomes so good at its kind of repressive capacities. And I think that this is a question that many people are asking right now, like watching the kind of protests as we continue in Iran, watching kind of what is over the last week or so, kind of growing into a protest movement in China. Where are the opportunities for any sort of like, public intervention or public mobilization in this kind of really like these dystopian kind of extremely strong, states that are, built on kind of surveillance and control.
Judith Butler utilizes the concept of grievability in her book, The Force of Nonviolence. So the question is that, do you think in attributing jihad or any sort of exotic violence to a specific time or to a specific geography, we are under the usage of being precise? Actually, we are trying to make it their fault and take it as less grievable than the death of the innocent people here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I don't use a ton of Butler's work, and some of her stuff I'm not a huge fan of, but this, I think the kind of question of like the grievability, or some people have put it in terms of like the body count and whose bodies count, is of enormous importance in kind of in thinking about the way that we rationalize, different forms of violence, and the way that we want to always differentiate between our violence and their violence. Right, so our violence is supposed to be rational. It's supposed to limit collateral damage. It's supposed to, it's state-directed violence, all X, Y, or Z, and we're supposed to kind of compare that to, the beheading of aid workers or journalists, and say, right, these two things are kind of fundamentally different. And they are fundamentally different, but that doesn't mean that they both can't be incredibly wrong in ethical terms. But that we are right. But what kind of Butler is keyed into is the role of culture, the way of these kind of dehumanizing discourses. The way that, again, that notion of the kind of ontological separation between East and West, us and them, the West and Islam, functions to make certain people's, certain people's loss, certain people's bodies just not grievable. It's a footnote, it's an aside, it's something that we can kind of, that we can brush off. Whereas, we'll kind of whereas the kind of, victims of like a 9/11 or something, like, right, their names will be known, they will be commemorated, so on and so forth. Like, you'll never have that for the, random children that are killed in US drone strikes in, in Yemen or Afghanistan or, Syria. and from an ethical perspective, we need to ask why. Why is that the case? And that is only the case because we have kind of decided that there is a fundamentally different ethical quality of the two forms of violence that are, that are being enacted here, kind of regardless of the kind of the damage that they inflict.
Right. So my last question.
Yeah.
And it's a bit long. Another counterintuitive idea in the book is that Islam is an all-encompassing system of legislation, and it's like a funhouse mirror, as you describe, that both reflects and negates the neoliberal attempts into the which both actually they go to the domain of marketplace. Here you quote the scholar Philip Bobbitt, who argues, I'm quoting him actually, in each era terrorism derives its ideology in reaction to the raison d'etre of the dominant constitutional order, at the same time negating and rejecting that form's unique ideology, but mimicking the form's structural characteristic, end of quote. My question, Susanne, do you think we will see in future more strange bedfellows where an ideology which seems to be the opposite of neoliberalism and yet mimic its structure deep inside?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of maybe just back up and explain why I'm like, how I got to this comparison, right? So I mentioned before this notion kind of developed by Said Qutb, but kind of advanced by a number of kind of jihadis, and kind of particularly in the kind of Salafi jihadi world, that that Islam is, of course, this all-encompassing system, but that in its directives are like ready-made. You just have to like pick up the Quran, and it'll be fairly easily apparent what you should do in any situation. And that the goal here, right, is to bring as much of life as possible under the purview of this apparently is the system of law, which is supposed to be ready-made. And what does that do? What that does is it always shields the reality of human interpretation, right? There's the intermediary role is always there. I quote kind of Roxanne Euban, this wonderful scholar, who says that the kind of denial that an interpretation is an interpretation is a definition of what it means to be a fundamentalist. So to say, no, this isn't my interpretation. I'm just a sieve. This is the pure divine truth right here, right? The laws, everything is here. It's always to kind of, functions to obscure the role of human judgment and human interpretation, deciding what the law is actually going to be. What are the conditions that you're going to kind of subject people to? And of course, that means taking these things outside of the realm where humans could debate them, could decide on them, right? Where we could have some sort of kind of democratic or parliamentary processes that would decide what the law is. Because no, everything is already perfectly given. So it's this, right? There's this very anti-democratic impulse to this that is kind of comes wrapped in its own particular theological scaffolding around this kind of notions of divine sovereignty and the kind of the already given nature of of law. And you compare that, on the other hand, to something that doesn't seem to be at all like this, but like to the kind of classic neoliberal vision. I quote Milton Friedman in my book on this, right? That the market is this efficient system, that it's again for distributing social goods, and that what we need to do is get as much of human activity as possible outside the realm of politics and into the realm of the market, because it is through the marketplace that all these decisions can be made in the optimal fashion. And again, denying the role of human intervention, denying the notion that like actually the market is a product of particular people, states, policies that actually make markets what they are, that enable them to function in particular ways, always obscuring that fact. And having this kind of mystical idea of the market, which seems to parallel the mystical idea of the law as these like ready-made entities that don't need any sort of human intervention on the one hand, and that are fundamentally anti-democratic on the other. With the idea being that there's no kind of intervention at the kind of level of politics that one should make in their kind of optimal functioning. So yes, these seem to be kind of like diametrically opposed ideas, but I would argue that the logic is actually quite similar. Or yes, they're like two sides of the same coin. And will we continue to see certain like these types of manifestations in the future? I mean, I imagine that they're going to look different, right? They're not going to look like they did in the 1960s and the 1970s, as our actual material and social conditions will continue to evolve. But insofar as our world is this globalized one that is, shaped by structures which are bigger than me, you, any individual culture, then yes, I would imagine that we're going to continue to see these things kind of popping up in unusual places. But that can be discerned if only we are willing to look for them, even if they seem a little bit, even if they seem a little bit counterintuitive at first.
Right, great. Thank you very much indeed, Susanna, for this wonderful talk.